Hello, everybody. Another episode here of Fire Breather Rob. I thank you guys for listening to us, whether it's on any of the platforms that we're on. We're on many platforms on. So if you are on one of the internet platforms, I please ask you to subscribe, like, share, and also hit the bell on the YouTube to make sure you get more of these podcasts. Thanks so much. So we have had quite a few people talk about climate change, but I'm pretty sure this guy is the biggest person we've had on. This is Dr. Michael Mann. He is a climatologist over at Penn State University, also the director of the Earth System Science Center. I'm sorry, the Earth System Science Center at Penn State University. So, Dr. Mann, thanks so much for coming on. Greatly appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Rob. It's good to be with you.
All right, so let's kick this around. So, you are a climatologist, and am I saying that right anyway?
Yeah, I call myself a climate scientist,
All
but climatologist. Just don't call me late for dinner, and we're fine.
All right. So, a climate scientist. So, what got you into that field?
Sure. Yeah. Back in graduate school, I actually even going further back, double majored in applied math and physics at UC Berkeley. Was interested in a career in theoretical physics. Went off to Yale University to study physics for my PhD. And then about midway through that, I realized that my heart wasn't really in it. I wanted to look for, a problem that was bigger, that had real world implications. And I saw that there was a professor in the Department of Geology and Geophysics who was using physics and math to model Earth's climate system. And it sounded fascinating to me. So I went and talked with him. One thing led to another, ended up doing my PhD in that department with him, Barry Saltzman, modeling Earth's climate system. And at the time, I really wasn't all that focused on the issue of climate change. My research had much more to do with natural climate cycles, but it led us down a path that ultimately resulted in the now somewhat iconic hockey stick curve that demonstrates how unusual the warming of the past century is, and by implication probably has to do with what we're doing. And that sort of put me then at the center of the very fractious debate over human-caused climate change. It's not the sort of the career path that I thought I had signed on to, but I've ultimately come to embrace this opportunity to inform this critical larger conversation.
So, let's dive deep into this. Obviously, the Trump administration is on their way out, in my opinion, thank God.
Kicking and screaming, but yeah.
So, with that, can you speak about the destruction by the Trump administration and what they've done to the climate in the 4 years in office?
Yeah, they've done a lot of damage. And during this campaign, I said that we couldn't afford another 4 years of Trump, that the planet couldn't afford another 4 years of Trump. And I still think that that's true. If he had had another opportunity, 4 more years, he would have been able to finish off the job that he and the polluters who ran his environmental policies had started. And so, as you note, over that 4 year period, he did his best. He filled his administration with fossil fuel industry lobbyists. And so it really wasn't Trump who was running the show. It was the fossil fuel industry. He had literally, given the fox the job of guarding the hen house when it comes to our environment. And they did a lot of damage. They reversed a whole lot of policies that had been put in place decades ago by the Nixon administration. I mean, they got rid of policies, environmental policies that had been put in place by past Republican administrations, by Nixon, by Reagan, by Bush. That's how bad they were. Fortunately, there's enough sort of inertia in the system. There are enough really good, solid, mid-level government, career scientists who were able to prevent, I would argue, the permanent damage that might have been done. And so we can reverse what the damage that was done. We can reinstate the policies that were there, but we've got to go beyond that now, right? Just signing on to Paris, that's not enough anymore, because we're 4 years down the road and we didn't make the progress we needed to make during those 4 years because of Trump.
Well, is the Paris Climate Accord such a huge deal? I know that was a big thing throughout the Obama administration, getting that done. At the time, Secretary of State John Kerry, huge on that. also with President Obama and obviously Vice President Biden. But my thing is, a lot of people said that that did not go far enough. We hear a lot in the progressive movement that I consider myself in with the Green New Deal. But let's talk about Paris. Was
Yeah.
that something that didn't go far enough? Is it really worth even jumping back in or trying to get something even bigger and better with the new Biden administration?
Yeah, so the thing is, Paris was really the first uh, international agreement that had some real teeth that every country in the world, save the United States, which backed out under Trump, had signed on to. And the commitments were in essence voluntary commitments, but there was sort of a name and shame sort of operation in force where countries that really weren't living up to their obligations, there was a lot of pressure put on them, and ultimately that there will be more pressure and there will be more mechanisms for enforcement. But it was important to get everybody on board. And look, it really has made a difference. We've seen carbon emissions level off. They're going to come down 7% this year, which is great news, except for that's in large part because of the COVID-19 response. Even taking that out of the equation, though, they probably would have come down a little bit just because of the inroads that renewable energy is making. We're seeing efforts among different countries to implement different types of constraints on carbon emissions. And so we're seeing progress. Paris contains within the agreement a ratcheting up mechanism. So what you can say is the current commitments under the Paris Agreement of the various countries, including us, aren't enough. They're not enough to keep carbon levels, CO2 levels below truly catastrophic levels of warming. But what they do put in place is a mechanism where those commitments are expected to be ratcheted up. And here's the thing. We sat on the sidelines for 4 years. Now, as you alluded to, we've got John Kerry, who helped negotiate the Paris Agreement in the first place, actually helped negotiate the bilateral agreement that came before it between China and the US, which really laid the foundation for Paris. And he has some real, bona fides in the diplomatic world internationally. And so that's huge for us to be able to say, we are ready once again to take a leadership role, not only to live up to our commitments, but to take a leadership role in stepping up those commitments. Let me touch on one other thing you asked about, the Green New Deal. So, I'm like a lot of us, I would love to see something as expansive as the Green New Deal pass Congress. Look, we've got the executive branch, which is great. There are a whole bunch of things that the Biden administration can do and is already doing to advance the cause of climate action from the executive standpoint. But ultimately, we really need climate legislation to complement that. I would love to see a Green New Deal. We would have needed a blue wave in the congressional elections to have an environment where that can pass. So my thinking right now is we look for some meaningful climate legislation over the next 2 years while working to create an atmosphere, an environment where we might be able to get something much bolder through Congress. In the meantime, 50-50 Congress, there is the possibility at least of getting a climate bill onto the floor. Mitch McConnell never would have done that. Obviously, under Democratic control, we'll get a climate bill or a set of bills onto the floor, and we might pass them with a few crossover votes from some moderate Republicans. Yeah.
Could you see cap and trade, something like that passing, something that moderate Republicans, and that was a Republican bill back in the day in the early 90s. Could you see something like that that's not really great, but at least it's something getting through Congress, passing the Senate, being signed into law by Joe Biden?
Yeah, and California has that system in place. There are a whole bunch of states that have implemented that. I mean, Mitt Romney actually provided the model legislation for cap and trade on carbon emissions in Massachusetts when he was governor there. And unfortunately, what you pointed out was really a Republican brainchild. Cap and trade originated under the George H.W. Bush administration from an EPA administrator, William K. Riley, who was a real hero in my book. He was a Republican, but he really cared about the environment. He took Bush to task for not doing enough. And did get this cap and trade agreement in place to deal with the problem of acid rain. And so that's a Republican idea. And it's ironic that Republicans have walked away from their own ideas. I don't know what form that'll take. What I would like to see is Democrats and Republicans at the table, and you know, maybe a half dozen or dozen moderate Republicans who are really listening, who don't want to be on the wrong side of history, and will join on to something that they think they can, that can pass Congress, and that they can, you know, that they can convince their constituents is, you know, is good for all of us.
But Dr. Mann, do you feel like this is not, a lot of this climate change isn't passing, is because still there's a huge hold as far as the money that's being pushed to these congressmen and women and also senators in Congress by the fossil fuel industry? Is it because of that hold, or is it just an ideological thing that if the Democrats are for it, we're not going to go with it? If the Republicans for it, then we're not going to pass it?
Yeah, you know, it's I consider myself a progressive, but I've got a few Republican friends, and one of them is Bob Inglis, who was a former conservative congressman from South Carolina, who was actually sort of a Reagan conservative, got primaried by the Koch brothers in his primary election because he wanted to do something on climate, and was replaced with Trey Gowdy, was the congressman who took his seat. Yeah, elections have consequences. And he travels around now trying to convince conservatives to get on board with climate legislation. And one of the things that, one of the stories he tells is, you know, I didn't know much about, you know, climate change when I, you know, first got involved in this. All I knew was that if Al Gore was for it, I was against it. and there's a big part of that. But a big part of it is the fossil fuel money, the Koch brothers, the plutocrats who have funded this massive disinformation campaign. And my book, The New Climate War, is sort of about the challenges we face now that we've really moved past outright denial, because you can't get away with it. They can't claim that nothing's happening anymore because people can see it. People feel it. So they're instead turning to other tactics in their effort to thwart action. And that has to do with actually stirring up discord within the progressive community, among sort of climate advocates, getting us fighting with each other over the details of policy, or, you know, our personal or individual sort of behavioral lifestyle choices. You know, are you vegan? Do you fly? Are you having children? Getting us fighting with each other and finger pointing and sort of behavior shaming each other, so we don't present a united front demanding change. Yeah, no, I wish I could have just spent my life at some level as a scientist doing what I had signed up to do, doing science, but I realized that you can't. If you're working in this field, the implications are too great, and there is this assault on the science that has deep consequences for all of us. And so I've devoted my life now to sort of trying to communicate that message. And yeah, so much of it has to do with money and politics, dark money, the fact that fossil fuel interests can basically install congressmen who will do their bidding. They can win elections, they can control our political process to an extent, but I think that stranglehold is starting to weaken, and I think that's why you do see you see a lot of younger Republicans who are coming on board, and you see sort of this cleavage now within the Republican Party, and the things that are playing out right now, playing out in our news cycle right now, may ultimately, ironically, have a favorable impact on things like climate policy, because I think that it's going to force some of the reasonable, moderate Republicans to distance themselves from what their party has become. And maybe that opens up an opportunity for meaningful compromise on things like climate. So yeah, that is the challenge. There's a huge amount of money behind this, and to the extent that it is no longer really focused on outright denial, it's still focused on stoking all of these other sort of tactics that they're using to prevent us from moving on and acting.
Well, Doc, these are the politicians where their families don't have to worry about the environmental racism. They're going to have that kind of money that if there's a big, like we're in Florida, if the state goes underwater, yeah, they're going to have a big fortress. They'll buy a big house on a hill, and they don't have to worry about the peons that are stuck with, you know, living in the
call
floods.
It Mar-a-Lago. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, Doc, what about down in Miami? I mean, you get a big heavy rainstorm, the place floods in 10 seconds. I mean, it's a total joke. And Miami actually, even with, well, they just elected a progressive mayor, but they used to have a Republican man. At least he was trying to do some things for climate change, to build that seawall higher and
Yeah,
things like that. But
yeah.
most of these Republicans, like you said, they don't do anything. And it's a lot of them is because they have family or they have a lot of money and they're not worried about their grandkids because the money's going to go down from one generation to the next. And, you know, the low middle class, white people, black people, Hispanic people, Asian, they're the ones that are going to have to worry about that. And they don't care because they're on a different scale.
Yeah, you know, and that's true. There are some Republicans, especially Florida Republicans, because
Yeah.
they're on the front lines. Their people are on the front lines of climate change. Let's face it, if you're on the coast of Florida, you're dealing with climate change impacts now. And so you do have some, you know, Carlos Rubello, who's congressman, he's no longer in Congress. He was on the right side of this issue. You even have people like Matt Gaetz, right?
Yeah.
Right-wing, ultra-right-wing Trump supporter, treasonist, arguably. Now, but even he has said, you know, hey, folks, we're on the wrong side of this issue. So you do see some Florida Republicans sort of coming along, and that, you know, there's progress being made. Marco Rubio doesn't deny climate change, but he wrote an op-ed, which I wrote a letter of response that was published, where he said, you know, it's real, but we just need to adapt. What does that mean? Do we grow fins and gills? And so there's still some bad faith there, but there is a movement away from the outright denial toward sort of kicking the can down the road.
I want to get into a couple of big topics. So I want to hurry into these because I don't want to take too much of your time today. But I want to get into these things. Doc, and this is Dr. Michael Mann. He is a climatologist at Pennsylvania State University. You know, are you worried about the Biden administration as they keep extending fracking, not on, you know, public lands, but, you know, there's still going to be fracking going on and the contamination of water and also earthquakes all around our country, which never had earthquakes before.
Yeah, so no doubt there are a whole lot of negative environmental consequences, not just the contribution to climate change, but water quality issues, all sorts of things, from hydraulic fracturing, fracking. And my good friend Josh Fox made a film, Gasland, about that. Gasland 2, he's got a sequel as well. And he's really been out there on the front lines communicating the environmental threat associated with that practice. I think the Biden administration, their policies on this have been a bit misunderstood. During the campaign, if you listen carefully, what they didn't want was to give an opening to Trump to bury them in Pennsylvania, to get, you know, the pro-fracking world really energized against him. They didn't want those folks energized. So he used very neutral wording. He didn't really want to get into that issue. He did say that we wouldn't ban fracking. He wanted to, you know, because that sounds really bad if you're in the industry. Oh, they're going to take away my job tomorrow. And so he did say that, and that is absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that he isn't against fracking. And the example I'll use is look at coal. Coal has undergone a death spiral over the last 4 years under Trump. What about Trump saving the coal industry? The problem was market forces have put it out of business. That death spiral, there was no, you know, ban on coal, right, under Trump. But the industry collapsed because the market forces are working against them. Increasingly, that's the case. Renewable energy is becoming far more competitive. Now, just allowing natural market forces to try to address these problems isn't enough. We've got to seize control of those market forces. And so what Biden's administration clearly is in favor of is imposing market mechanisms that will price natural gas out of the market. Will ramp it down pretty quickly, just like what happened with coal. And that, we call that a demand side. You know, you put a price on carbon, you provide incentives for renewable energy, so there's the carrot and the stick. Now there's also the supply side of it. You stop providing infrastructure, government-funded infrastructure for the fossil fuel industry, and you take away their subsidies. And Biden has said he's in favor of that too, taking away their subsidies. And the idea here is to use market mechanisms to drive them out of business. He doesn't, they're not in support of fracking. They don't want fracking to continue, but they just didn't want to say that we were going to ban it. That just sounded a little too draconian, and that to be caught saying that during the election would have provided a commercial for their opponents. But no, Biden is on the right side of this issue. I'm pretty convinced of that.
To push back not against you, but against the Biden administration in general, quickly, the better statement would be, let's do a Green New Deal, create millions upon millions of jobs. As you said, that all these fracking people worried about, oh, now I'm going to lose my job. I'm not going to be able to frack. You say, hey, well, we're going to make a Green New Deal and create millions of jobs. But, the campaign is over, and hopefully maybe a change of heart down the road. But that's all we can hope for. I want to move into China, Doc, because I think this is a huge thing. Can we talk about what your opinion is as far as China, which is another world power and one of the biggest world powers, if not the biggest in the world, as far as their environmental policy goes, because they're going to be a big thing as far as Paris goes or any other climate change agreements go. You spoke about John Kerry working with China in the past in the Obama administration. But my thing is with China is they seem like they're already moving towards green energy and really building a huge green energy infrastructure throughout their country. So they're way ahead of us. Do you agree with that? Or should we be looking to China as far as maybe building some of the same stuff they have built already in their country?
No, I do agree with that. And there's a certain irony there, that it may be that these command and control economies, like China, that aren't driven by market forces that mandate, government policy to what they see as the collective good of the people, that they're in a better position to implement some of these top-down policy changes. And China, as you note, has moved rapidly. They were decommissioning coal-fired power plants way ahead of their commitments under the Paris Agreement. Then Trump came in, said, we're no longer committed to it. That was almost a unilateral defiance of the bilateral agreement. It really was. And then China at that point actually sort of became a bit more lax in their efforts. They did start to build some more coal-fired power plants. They eased off on some of their efforts to reduce carbon emissions. But I think they now see that the US is back at the table. Look, they're still spending more than any other country in developing clean energy, solar panel technology, et cetera, and shipping that out to the rest of the world. So China really can be marshaled as a force for good here. But the United States, only if the United States is acting as a good faith partner. And that's why it was so important that Biden sort of, the first thing that he do is communicate to the world community. And I'm looking at you, China, that we're ready to lead on this issue and to meet our obligations and to ratchet up those obligations. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see some really meaningful domestic progress here on the issue over the next couple of years and internationally as well.
I hope so, because we definitely need it. And this is a good segue into the last few questions. So we look back at 2020. We started out the year in Australia where we saw those koala bears, which was such a sad sight, in their homes getting burned down along with the kangaroos. Obviously,
I was there.
You were there. Oh, wow.
Sabbatical in Sydney at the time. Yep.
Well, definitely, I want you to talk about that in just a second. We did see, obviously, the Amazon rainforest and the deforestation, which created a lot of fires over there. And obviously, that is the lungs of the world right there. And then we saw in California, Colorado, Oregon, all over the West Coast, the wildfires there. And then the hurricanes in Louisiana and Texas, which really hit those two states extremely hard. So obviously, the pandemic has been extremely tough and it keeps going on. A bad year of 2020, but also these natural disasters. Could you go into these natural disasters? I know you just brought up that you were in Australia, but in general, all these natural disasters happening at one time. How did they happen? Can we do anything? Is there any hope?
Yeah, because the reason is they're not natural disasters. They're unnatural disasters. We've created them. Climate change has exacerbated these extreme weather events. And I indeed saw that play out in a profound way when I was down, just entirely coincidentally, because I had planned out that sabbatical years in advance. And I happened to arrive in late 2019, early 2020, as that was all playing out, and ended up witnessing the devastating impacts of climate change in real time during my stay down under. And it actually provided an opportunity to really to talk to the Australian people and to try to communicate why this is happening and why it's so important that they too re-engage in the international effort to act on climate. So, we don't have to use our imagination anymore, as you allude to. The unprecedented wildfires, heat waves, floods, superstorms that we are now seeing play out, dangerous climate change has arrived. And it's really a matter at this point of how bad we're willing to let it get. So there is great urgency in bringing down carbon emissions dramatically by a factor of 2 at least over the next decade if we're going to avert catastrophic, even more catastrophic climate change impacts. There is urgency, but as I like to say, there's also agency. We can do this, and we now have renewed leadership here in the United States, and we're re-engaging the international community. So let's focus on that over the next couple of years to make sure that we get back on track now that we have an opportunity to do so.
So with the last 2 questions, Dr. Mann here on Fire Breathing Rob. Doc, can we talk about, we heard all this scary information, but it's information that's scary, but it is true information. What should viewers do to make themselves better world citizens?
There are things we can do in our everyday lives to decrease our environmental footprint, and we should all do those things, right? So, eating, more carbon-friendly diet, using less resources, using less electricity, conserving, electing to get your energy from a renewable supplier, or installing solar panels, rooftop solar. There are so many things that we can do in our everyday lives. Walking to school or to work rather than driving, and if we are using transportation, using public transportation, flying less. All of these things help out, and there's so many things that we can do like that save us money. They make us healthier. They make us feel better, and they set a good example for others. And so, why wouldn't we do these things? We should do these things, but we have to recognize that alone isn't enough. And the forces of inaction would like you to think that it's all just about individual behavior and lifestyle, because that sort of takes the pressure off of them. The reality is that we need policies. We need our politicians because we can't do that. We can't put a price on carbon. We can't provide incentives for renewable energy in the marketplace. Only our elected leaders can do that. And so we have to elect politicians who are willing to do that, rather than politicians who will simply advance the agenda of the fossil fuel industry and of polluters. And so voting is an important part of it. In this last election, we made some progress. We voted in a Democratic Congress and a president who will act on climate. That was a good first step, but we have to keep the pressure on. We have to continue to demand accountability by our politicians, and to use our voice in every way possible to make sure that we collectively move in this direction.
So, Doc, as the last question is, can you give the viewers some hope? Because it seems like from all the natural disasters and even 2020 in general, the clock is at 12 for the environment. We're at midnight. Is that true? Is that false? And also, can you give us hope as we end the interview?
Yeah, I know my friends at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists are the ones who every year update the doomsday clock,
doomsday,
right?
right.
I don't know where we are. We're 11:57, 11:58, and climate change is part of that. Actually, climate change has become a dominant consideration every year. When you hear that they've updated the clock, climate change is a big part of that. So yeah, we're into the 11:50s anyways, and we certainly don't want to hit midnight. The good news is that there is still time to make sure that we don't hit midnight, which is to say, at least with regard to climate change, there is still time to reduce our carbon emissions fast enough to avert a catastrophic 1.5 degrees Celsius, roughly 3 degree Fahrenheit warming of the planet, which is where we're pretty sure the worst impacts really start to set in, and irreversible impacts, climate change impacts, if we allow the planet to warm up that much. And more good news is the fact that we now understand, based on the climate modeling of the last decade and the way we model the carbon cycle, the carbon when it goes into the atmosphere, some of it comes back out. It's taken up by plants, it's taken up by the oceans. And so if we stop burning carbon, the oceans are continuing to take carbon out of the atmosphere and CO2 levels drop. So it turns out that offsets what we call the thermal inertia, just the fact that once you warm up the climate, it wants to continue warming up. Those two things sort of basically cancel out, and you get a flat line, which is to mean if we stop burning carbon right now, the surface temperature of the planet stops warming up within a few years. And so there is urgency, as we've been talking about, but there is agency. Our actions now have a direct and an immediate consequence.
All right. And thanks so much, Dr. Michael Mann. Thanks so much for your time. Definitely check out his work, search for him. Dr. Mann, as we end, can you tell the viewers where they can buy the book and even find more about you in general?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, they can go to www.michaelmann.net, and there are links there. You can find our book, the New Climate War, on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, but also at your independent bookseller. And we should try to help them out, especially in these difficult times. So check out, with your local independent bookseller, Powell's in Oregon. There are other independent bookstores that you can order it from. And you can always find it on, Amazon.com and Barnes and Noble as well, and the publisher's site. And there's a link to that on my website, www.michaelmann.net. And I believe that if you type www.newclimatewar.com, it'll also take you to the book page on my website.
All right, Dr. Mann, thanks so much for your time. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.